The desert wind carried the scent of sage and danger as 17-year-old Ayana crouched behind the red rock outcropping. Her dark eyes scanned the valley below where the white settlement of Cedar Ridge lay sleeping under the pale moonlight. The wooden buildings looked small and fragile against the vast Arizona landscape, but she knew the men inside them carried weapons that could kill from great distances. Tonight would change everything. Tonight would prove she deserved the respect her father had always denied her. A woman's place is with the cooking fires and the children, Chief Running Wolf had declared just hours earlier when the tribal council met to discuss the increasing raids by the cavalry. War is for men who have proven their courage in battle. Ayana's hands clenched into fists as she remembered those words. She had trained alongside the young warriors since childhood, could track a deer through solid rock country and shoot an arrow through a coin tossed in the air. Yet still her father saw only a daughter, who should be learning to weave baskets and prepare meals. The other Apache women accepted their roles without question. Her cousin Nalnish seemed content to spend her days grinding corn and gossiping with the older women. Even her best friend Itzel had recently married a young warrior and now spoke only of babies and household duties. But Ayana felt fire in her blood that could not be cooled by domestic life. She had watched, too, many of her people die in the endless conflicts with the white soldiers. Her younger brother Kitchi had fallen just 3 moons ago, cut down by cavalry sabers while defending their winter camp. The memory of his blood soaking into the desert sand still haunted her dreams. She could not sit idle while more of her family faced such danger. The plan had come to her during the evening meal, when her father spoke with the war leaders. A supply wagon carrying rifles and ammunition would pass through the narrow canyon east of Cedar Ridge just before dawn. If the Apache could capture those weapons, they would have a real chance of defending their homeland against future attacks. "It is too dangerous," Running Wolf had said when the younger warriors proposed an attack. "The canyon is a trap. If the soldiers surround us there, none would escape alive." But Ayana knew something the men did not. During her countless hunting trips through that country, she had discovered a hidden passage through the cliff face that would allow a small group to escape if the attack went badly. The passage was too narrow for horses, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. But it led to safety on the far side of the mountains. She had tried to speak up during the council meeting, but her father's stern glare silenced her before she could share her knowledge. Women were not permitted to address the warriors during discussions of war. The old ways demanded silence from daughters, even when that silence might cost lives. After the council disbanded with no decision made, Ayana had approached her father privately. She explained about the hidden passage and begged him to reconsider the attack. Running Wolf listened with growing anger, his weathered face growing darker with each word she spoke. "You shame me with this talk of war," he said finally. "A chief's daughter should set an example of proper behavior for the other women. Instead you run wild through the mountains like a boy who has not yet learned discipline." "But father, the passage could save lives. Our people need those weapons. Our people need their women to act like women." Running Wolf's voice carried the authority of absolute command. "You will not speak of this again. Tomorrow you will begin proper training with your aunt. She will teach you the skills you should have learned years ago." The conversation had ended there, but Ayana's determination had only grown stronger. If her father would not listen to wisdom because it came from a woman's lips, then she would have to prove her worth through action instead of words. She had waited until the camp slept, then gathered her weapons and slipped away into the night. Her plan was simple but dangerous. She would reach the canyon before the supply wagon arrived, use her knowledge of the hidden passage to position herself perfectly for an ambush, and capture the weapons single-handedly. When she returned to camp with rifles and ammunition, even Running Wolf would have to acknowledge her skill as a warrior. The journey to Cedar Ridge had taken 3 hours of careful movement through terrain she knew better than the lines on her own palms. Now, as she studied the sleeping settlement, Ayana felt the first stirrings of doubt. The plan had seemed so clear when she formed it in the safety of her family's lodge. Here, in the cold reality of the desert night, the enormity of what she was attempting began to sink in. She was one person against an unknown number of soldiers. The supply wagon might be heavily guarded. Even if she managed to capture the weapons, carrying them back to camp alone would be nearly impossible. And if she failed, if she was killed or captured, her death would bring shame upon her father and her entire clan. But the memory of Kitchi's face gave her strength. Her brother had believed in her abilities even when their father did not. During their last conversation, he had spoken of a future where Apache men and women would fight side by side to protect their homeland. "You have the heart of a warrior, sister," he had whispered as he lay dying from his wounds. "Do not let anyone convince you otherwise." Those words echoed in her mind as Ayanna began her descent toward the valley floor. The settlement appeared even smaller as she drew closer, its handful of buildings clustered around a central well like cattle gathered for protection. Lamplight flickered in one window where someone kept a late watch, but otherwise the town seemed completely at peace. She moved like a shadow between the buildings, her soft-soled moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. Years of hunting had taught her to become one with the landscape, to flow like water around obstacles without disturbing the natural rhythm of the night. Even the settlement's dogs remained quiet as she passed, sensing no threat from her controlled movement. The stable stood at the eastern edge of town, positioned to allow easy access to the canyon road. Ayanna slipped inside and found exactly what she had hoped for: 3 cavalry horses resting in their stalls. One was a powerful black stallion that looked capable of carrying heavy loads over long distances. If she could steal that horse and use it to transport the captured weapons, her task would become much more manageable. She spent several minutes, calming the animal with gentle touches and soft words in Apache. The horse responded well to her confident handling, and soon she had a makeshift bridle fashioned from leather strapping found in the stable. Leading the stallion outside, she mounted smoothly and guided it toward the canyon road. The horse's hooves made soft thuds against the packed dirt as they left the settlement behind. Ayanna kept the animal to a steady walk, knowing that speed would only create noise and dust clouds visible in the moonlight. She had perhaps 2 hours before the supply wagon was scheduled to arrive, plenty of time to reach the canyon and prepare her ambush position. As they traveled, she reviewed every detail of her plan. The hidden passage was located about halfway through the canyon, concealed behind a screen of desert brush that had taken root in a crack in the cliff face. From that position, she could see the entire length of the narrow road while remaining completely invisible to anyone passing below. When the wagon entered the canyon, she would wait until it reached the narrowest point where the walls rose straight up on both sides. There, escape would be impossible for the soldiers even if they realized they were under attack. She planned to use fire arrows to spook the horses pulling the wagon. In the confined space of the canyon, frightened animals would create chaos that she could use to her advantage. While the soldiers fought to control their mounts and maintain their positions, she would descend from her hiding place and capture the weapons through speed and surprise rather than direct confrontation. The stolen cavalry horse proved to be well-trained and responsive to her commands. As they approached the canyon entrance, Ayanna dismounted and led the animal up a steep game trail that she had used many times during hunting expeditions. The path was treacherous in the darkness, but she knew every rock and turn by heart. 20 minutes of careful climbing brought them to a natural shelf about 50 feet above the canyon floor. Here she could leave the horse safely hidden while she made her way to the concealed passage. The animal would wait patiently for her return. Trained by cavalry discipline to remain calm even during battle, Ayanna gathered her weapons and checked each one carefully. Her bow was strung with fresh sinew and tested for proper tension. The quiver on her back held 20 arrows, 5 of them fitted with special points designed to carry burning cloth. Her knife was sharp enough to cut leather with a whisper-soft touch. Most importantly, she carried a small pot of pitch mixed with pine resin that would burn hot and bright when ignited. The passage entrance was exactly where she remembered it, hidden behind a screen of scrub oak and mountain mahogany that had grown thick enough to block it from view. Squeezing through the narrow opening, she found herself in a natural chimney that rose through the solid rock of the canyon wall. Ancient handholds carved by wind and water made climbing possible, Though the ascent was treacherous even for someone with her experience, she climbed steadily upward, feeling for each handhold with Karif. The canyon erupted into chaos as the burning arrows found their marks. The lead wagon horse reared up screaming, flames licking at the cloth wrapped around the arrow shaft embedded in its shoulder. The other horses caught the scent of fire and blood, and within seconds the entire team was in full panic. The heavy supply wagon lurched sideways as the terrified animals tried to bolt in different directions. Their traces tangling dangerously. Sergeant Marcus Powell fought to control his own mount as it danced sideways, spooked by the smell of burning pitch and the screams of wounded horses. His 20 years of cavalry experience kicked in automatically, and he began shouting orders to his men even as he scanned the canyon walls for signs of their attackers. "Dismount! Take cover behind the rocks. Watch the high ground." But Ayanna was already moving. While the soldiers struggled with their panicked horses, she slipped down from her ledge using a route she had scouted earlier. The natural chimneys and ledges in the canyon wall provided perfect cover as she descended toward the road level. Her years of hunting in this country had taught her to move like water flowing downhill. Silent and unstoppable. She reached a position directly above the overturned wagon just as the soldiers managed to get their horses under control. From here she could see the wooden crates clearly. They were marked with military stenciling that confirmed her hopes. Rifles 30 cal and ammunition -500 rounds. These weapons could arm 30 Apache warriors and give her people a real chance of defending their homeland. Powell had positioned his men in a defensive circle around the wagon, their rifles trained on the canyon walls above. He was a smart soldier who understood tactics, and he knew that any attack in this narrow space had to come from above. What he did not know was that his opponent was already behind his defensive line, hidden among the rocks at road level. "Johnson, can you see anything up there?" Powell called to his best marksman. Private Johnson squinted through his rifle sights at the canyon rim 200 feet above. "Nothing moving, Sergeant." But those arrows came from somewhere up high. "Maybe it was just one Apache scout," suggested Corporal Williams, the youngest member of the patrol. "Could be he's already running back to warn the main war party." Powell shook his head grimly. "Apache don't waste arrows on scouting. This was an attack, and it's not over yet." He was more right than he knew. Ayanna had worked her way around to within 30 feet of the wagon, close enough to see the soldiers' faces clearly. They were experienced fighters who had survived many battles, but they were also tired men at the end of a long patrol. More importantly, they were looking in the wrong direction for their enemy. She had to move fast. The fire arrows had done their job of creating chaos, but the soldiers were already regaining their composure. Soon they would organize a systematic search of the area, and her hiding place would not remain secret for long. This was her moment to strike while confusion still worked in her favor. Ayanna chose her target carefully. Sergeant Powell was clearly the leader, and removing him would leave the others without coordination. But he was also the most alert and experienced fighter in the group. Better to start with one of the younger soldiers who might be more easily surprised. Private Daniels was crouched behind a boulder about 15 feet from her position. His attention focused entirely on the canyon walls above. He was young, maybe 19 years old, with the kind of baby face that suggested he had never seen real combat before this patrol. His rifle was held correctly, but his hands shook slightly with nervous energy. Moving with the fluid grace of a hunting cat, Ayanna slipped from her hiding place and crossed the open ground in complete silence. Her knife appeared in her hand as she closed the distance, its blade catching no reflection in the pre-dawn darkness. Daniels never knew she was there until her arm wrapped around his throat and the knife point pressed against his neck. "Do not move," she whispered in English, her voice barely audible above the continued stamping of the nervous horses. "Do not call out. If you obey, you will live." Daniels froze completely, his rifle falling from nerveless fingers as he felt the sharp steel against his skin. He had heard stories about what Apache warriors did to captured soldiers, and he had no desire to test those tales for accuracy. He nodded slightly to show he understood. "Good," Ayanna murmured. "Now you will help me take the weapons from the wagon." Move slowly and keep your hands where I can see them." Using Danielle's as a human shield, she began working her way toward the overturned supply wagon. The other soldiers were still watching the canyon walls, unaware that their enemy was already among them. But Powell was too experienced a fighter to remain distracted for long. Soon he would look around to check on his men, and then the real battle would begin. The wagon had tipped onto its side when the horses bolted, spilling several wooden crates onto the rocky ground. Ayanna could see rifles scattered among the stones, beautiful weapons that represented hope for her people's survival. All she had to do was gather as many as she could carry and escape through her hidden passage before the soldiers could stop her. But as she forced Daniels closer to the weapons, a new problem became clear. The rifles were heavy military models designed for cavalry use. Even if she could carry 3 or 4 of them, that would barely make a difference in the larger conflict. Her people needed all 30 rifles and the ammunition that went with them. Not just a symbolic handful, she needed help to transport such a heavy load. But she had planned this mission as a solitary effort to prove her individual worth as a warrior. Now she realized that her father's emphasis on cooperation and planning might have been wiser than her desire for personal glory. "Daniels, where are you?" Sergeant Powell's voice cut through her thoughts like a sword blade. He had finally noticed that one of his men was missing. The young soldier tensed under her grip, clearly wanting to respond to his sergeant's call. Ayanna pressed the knife more firmly against his throat, drawing a thin line of blood that made him gasp quietly. "Stay silent," she warned. "Your life depends on it." Powell was moving now, checking each of his men's positions with the systematic thoroughness of an experienced combat veteran. It would only be seconds before he reached their location and discovered what was happening. Ayanna had to act quickly or lose any chance of completing her mission. She forced Daniels to kneel beside the nearest crate of rifles and used her free hand to pry open the wooden lid. Inside, 30 Springfield rifles lay nested in straw packing, their metal parts gleaming with protective oil. Each weapon represented the death of Apache warriors if left in military hands, but also the potential salvation of her people if she could somehow capture them. "Help me lift these rifles," she whispered to Daniels. "Move slowly and do exactly as I tell you." The young soldier's hands shook as he reached for the nearest weapon, but he obeyed her commands without question. Together they managed to lift out 4 rifles before Powell's voice called again, much closer this time. "Daniels, report your position." This time the sergeant's tone carried real concern and growing suspicion. Ayanna knew she had perhaps 30 seconds before he found them, and then her only advantage would disappear. She needed a new plan that would let her escape with at least some of the weapons while avoiding a direct confrontation with 5 armed soldiers. The answer came to her as she looked at the panicked horses still tangled in their traces 20 feet away. If she could reach the animals and free them from the wagon, their continued panic would create enough distraction for her to escape with the weapons she had already gathered. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all she had left. "Stay here and do not move," she told Daniels. "If you try to warn the others, I will kill you before they can help." She slipped away from the soldier and began working her way toward the horses, using the overturned wagon as cover. The animals were still agitated from the fire arrows, rolling their eyes and snorting nervously at every small sound. Getting close to them would be dangerous even for someone with her experience handling horses, but before she could reach the animals, a rifle shot cracked through the canyon like thunder. The bullet struck sparks from a rock inches from her head, and suddenly Powell's voice was shouting orders with crisp authority. "There, behind the wagon. Surround her." Somehow the sergeant had spotted her movement despite her careful approach. Now all pretense of stealth was finished, and she faced the prospect of a direct fight against impossible odds. 5 experienced soldiers with modern rifles against 1 Apache girl with a knife and a few arrows. Even the greatest warrior who had ever lived could not win such a battle through skill alone, but Ayanna was her father's daughter, and Running Wolf had taught all his children never to surrender while breath remained in their bodies. If she was going to die in this canyon, she would die like an Apache warrior, fighting to her last heartbeat for the freedom of her people She rolled sideways as another shot rang out, the bullet striking the ground where she had been lying just a moment before. The soldiers were closing in from multiple directions now, their rifles trained on the area around the wagon. Soon they would have her surrounded with no possibility of escape. That was when the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the canyon entrance, growing rapidly louder as multiple horses approached at a foo. The Apache camp was already stirring with morning activity when Ayanna and the war party crested the final ridge overlooking their village. Smoke from cooking fires drifted up between the traditional lodges, and she could see women moving among the dwellings as they began their daily tasks. Children played near the stream that provided water for the camp, their laughter carrying on the desert breeze like music from a more peaceful world. But Ayanna knew that peace was an illusion that would shatter the moment her father learned of the night's events. Running Wolf stood outside his lodge in the center of camp, his arms crossed and his weathered face set in lines of barely controlled anger. Even at this distance, she could feel the weight of his displeasure like a physical force pressing down on her shoulders. The other warriors in their party seemed to sense the coming storm as well. Dakota rode beside her in silence, his usual easy confidence replaced by obvious nervousness about facing their chief's wrath. The young men had defied a direct order by following her to the canyon. An Apache law was clear about the consequences of such disobedience. "Maybe we should have stayed away longer," muttered one of the warriors. "Given him time to cool his temper." "Running Wolf's anger burns like desert fire," Dakota replied grimly. "Time only feeds the flames instead of cooling them." As they rode into camp, the normal sounds of morning activity gradually ceased. Women paused in their work to stare at the returning warriors and the captured weapons they carried. Children stopped their games and gathered in small groups, whispering among themselves as they sensed the tension that surrounded the war party like storm clouds. The horses' hooves made soft thuds against the packed earth as they approached the central area where the tribal council conducted its business. Running Wolf waited beside the sacred fire that burned continuously in the heart of the camp, his presence commanding attention from every person within sight. Other senior warriors had gathered around him, their faces showing the same disapproval that radiated from their chief. Ayanna dismounted and walked forward to face her father, the captured rifle still slung across her back. Each step felt like a march toward judgment, but she kept her head high and her spine straight. Whatever punishment awaited her, she would accept it with the dignity befitting a warrior who had succeeded in battle. "So," Running Wolf said, his voice carrying the quiet intensity that was more frightening than shouting, "my daughter chooses to disobey her chief and risk the lives of our young men for the sake of proving a point. The mission succeeded, father. We captured 30 rifles and enough ammunition to arm our best warriors for many battles. The mission?" Running Wolf's eyes blazed with fury. "You call this reckless adventure a mission? You had no authority to plan attacks against our enemies. You had no right to endanger the lives of warriors who were foolish enough to follow you." Dakota stepped forward, his face showing the courage that had made him respected among the younger men. "With respect, Chief Running Wolf, we chose to follow Ayanna because her plan was sound. The weapons we captured will help protect our people." "And if the plan had failed? If you had all been killed or captured in that canyon? What protection would our people have then?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the sacred fire. Ayanna knew her father was right to be angry about the risks they had taken. A successful outcome did not justify the reckless way she had proceeded without permission or proper planning. But the memory of her brother Kitchi's death still burned in her heart, and she could not regret fighting to prevent more such losses. "I would rather die as a warrior than live as a woman forbidden to defend her people," she said quietly. "Kitchi died because we did not have the weapons to fight back effectively. Now we do." Running Wolf's face darkened further at the mention of his fallen son. "Do not speak your brother's name to justify this disobedience. Kitchi died because he followed orders and fought where his chief commanded him to fight. He died with honor, not shame. And what honor is there in sitting idle while our enemies grow stronger? What honor is there in denying half our people the chance to fight for their homeland?" The words escaped before Ayana could stop them, carrying all the frustration and pain she had kept buried inside for so long. Around the sacred fire, the gathered warriors stirred uneasily at her boldness in challenging their chief so directly. Such defiance could not be tolerated. Regardless of the success of her mission, Running Wolf studied his daughter's face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried the weight of absolute authority. "You have forgotten your place, daughter. You have forgotten the wisdom of our ancestors who understood that survival requires order and discipline. Your actions have brought shame upon our family and division to our people." He turned to address the gathered crowd that had formed around them. "Let all hear the judgment of their chief. Ayana, daughter of Running Wolf, is banished from this camp. She will take nothing but the clothes she wears and walk alone into the desert. If she lives through 7 sunsets without the protection of her people, she may return and face a new judgment." The sentence struck Ayana like a physical blow. Banishment was one of the most severe punishments in Apache law, reserved for crimes that threatened the very existence of the tribe. To survive 7 days alone in the desert without weapons, food, or shelter would require skills and luck that few possessed. Many who faced such exile simply disappeared into the vastness of the wilderness, never to be seen again. But even more painful than the physical danger was the spiritual meaning of banishment. To be cut off from her people, from the sacred fire and the ancient traditions that defined Apache life, was like having her soul torn from her body. She would become less than human, a wandering spirit without connection to the world of the living. "Father, please," she whispered, her proud facade finally cracking under the weight of his judgment. "I only wanted to help our people. I only wanted to prove myself worthy." "Worthy?" Running Wolf's voice carried decades of pain and hard-won wisdom. "A warrior's worth is not proven by individual glory or reckless courage. It is proven by loyalty to the tribe, by placing the needs of the many above the desires of the few. You have shown yourself capable in battle, but you have also shown yourself dangerous to the unity our people need to survive." The older women in the crowd began to murmur their approval of the chief's decision. They had lived through many wars and understood the importance of discipline in times of crisis. But some of the younger people, especially the unmarried women, watched Ayana with expressions that mixed sympathy with something that might have been admiration. Dakota and the other warriors who had followed her stood frozen by the severity of the sentence. They had expected punishment for their disobedience, but not the complete exile of their leader. Several of them looked as though they wanted to speak in her defense, but none dared challenge Running Wolf's judgment so directly. "However," the chief continued, his voice carrying a subtle change in tone that made everyone listen more carefully, 7 sunsets is a long time for a young woman to survive alone in the desert. If she proves herself capable of that feat, if she demonstrates the skills and wisdom necessary to live without the protection of her people, then perhaps she will return with a better understanding of what it truly means to be a warrior." Ayana looked up sharply, catching something in her father's words that might have been hope disguised as continued punishment. The traditional banishment was supposed to be a death sentence, but Running Wolf had spoken of her return as though he expected it rather than merely allowing for the possibility. "And if I do return," she asked carefully, "what then?" Running Wolf's expression remained stern, but she thought she caught a glimmer of something softer in his eyes. "If you return, daughter, we will speak of your place among our warriors. Not as a woman pretending to be a man, but as a person who has proven herself worthy of trust and responsibility." The words sent a shock through the gathered crowd. No Apache woman had ever been accepted as a full warrior, regardless of her skills or courage in battle. The ancient traditions were clear about the roles assigned to each gender, and those traditions had guided their people through centuries of survival in harsh environments, but the world was changing around them. The cavalry had better weapons and more soldiers than ever before, and the old ways of fighting might not be enough to protect their homeland. Perhaps it was time to consider new approaches to warfare, new sources of strength that their ancestors had never needed to explore. "Take nothing but what you wear," Running Wolf commanded, his voice returning to its formal tone. Begin your exile now, before the sun grows too hot for safe travel. If you live, return to us in 7 days. If you die, die with whatever honor you can still claim. Ayana removed the captured rifles from her back and placed them carefully beside the sacred fire. They would be distributed among the tribe's best warriors, adding to their defensive capabilities just as she had hoped. Her mission had succeeded even if the personal cost was higher than she had expected. She looked around the camp one final time, memorizing the faces of people who had been her entire world since birth. Her aunt stood among the older women, tears streaming down her wui.